in 6 small bins attached to the drop sides of the flatbed on which the gun was mounted, most DMAGs carried a further and larger supply in a 2-wheeled trailer. A total number of 7 crewmen were required to drive the half-track and operate the flak gun. The principal disadvantage of this type was that the crew were totally exposed to enemy fire, steps to give the vehicle a modicum of armour protection not being taken until late in the production run. An armoured cab being provided for the driver and a shield for the flak gun. Other than this modification, the DMAG remained otherwise unchanged, being produced by a variety of industrial concerns until production was halted in 1944, by which time 610 had been produced. It was to serve in all theatres and saw action until the end of the war. The Flak Panzer 38T was a makeshift machine put into production to bolster numbers of mobile flak, pending availability of more sophisticated flak panzers. With Luftwaffe air superiority long since vanished from the skies above the battlefields in east and west, the army needed every flak vehicle it could muster. The German army had a propensity for arming every chassis that could mount a worthwhile weapon. Standard lorries like the Opel Blitz and Horch heavy passenger car were modified to carry the 20mm flak, most being employed in the ground support role. Such was the versatility of the Krauss-Maffei-built 8-ton half-track that 319 were employed to mount the 20mm flak Vierling, with production continuing until 1944. To accommodate the weapon, all the seating and ammunition stowage lockers of the artillery prime mover were removed and replaced with a flatbed with dropped sides. The flak Vierling was mounted on the flatbed. 10 crew were needed to both drive and service the weapon, and the ammunition was normally carried in a trailer. The need for some degree of protection for the driver was recognised in 1943 when an armoured cab was fitted. An example of this later type is seen in Budapest in early '44. One of the more graphic sequences of film showing the flak Vierling and 8-ton half-track in action was taken during the Operation Market Garden, the abortive Allied attempt to seize and hold the bridges over the River Rhine at Arnhem in September 1944. The cameraman was on hand to record an SS flak Vierling being employed to shoot up the descending British paratroopers and the aircraft bringing them from England. Later supply flights by Sterling Transports paid dearly as the flak was able to take advantage of their need to fly low over the drop zones. Many were lost. Armoured lorries also mounted the flak Vierling. This example is seen in Italy in 1944. While just 3,000 5-ton half-tracks were built by Bussing NAG, some 339 were utilised to mount the 37mm flak 36. As with all the half-tracks modified as flak carriages, the troop compartment was replaced by a flatbed with dropped sides. Ammunition was carried in a trailer. The weapon was used in the anti-aircraft and ground support roles, and most were employed in the east. These 5-ton half-tracks are serving with the flak battalions of the 2nd SS Panzer Grenadier Division on the advance of the SS Panzer Corps during the Kursk offensive in July 1943. The 8-ton 7 half-track was adapted to carry the 37mm flak 36 in 1943 when production of the 5-ton 37mm flak carriage was ended. The addition of the gun raised the chassis weight to 11.5 tons. Ammunition for the flak gun was carried in a Sonder Anhänger 57, a trailer specially designed to carry 37mm ammunition. The flak 36 was a powerful weapon and was often used in a direct fire role. Most of the half-tracks seen in this sequence belong to the Waffen-SS, and in particular the flak Abteilung of the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler. Seen here in Rome, it is a late machine with an armoured cab. Moving along a Normandy road is a camouflaged Opel Multier mounting a 37mm flak. From the newsreel of May 1943 comes film of a major Luftwaffe ground exercise in Russia involving a full-strength flak unit. Of interest is the diversity of equipment being employed. Apart from the standard DMAG 1-ton half-tracks mounting the 20mm flak, there are also a large number of modified 4-wheel drive Mercedes-Benz 4.5-ton lorries. The commander of this 88mm gun detachment seemingly has no compunction about employing his weapon in a ground support or anti-tank role. Colonel Hans von Luck of 21st Panzer Division was to recall how in Normandy he had to threaten to shoot an officer of the Luftwaffe 16th Field Division who refused to employ his 88s in the anti-tank role during Operation Goodwood. The period when this film was taken is significant. The Eastern Front was experiencing its longest lull of the war, as the Soviets deliberately held back from offensive operations in order to prepare to receive the inevitable German summer offensive directed at the Kursk salient. The period prior to July the 5th, when Operation Citadel was finally launched, marked one of the most rigorous periods of training and exercises undertaken by the German armies in the East. The supposition is that this unit is waiting to take part in the operation. Although Luftwaffe command of the air was no longer assured in Russia, the Red Air Force had yet to achieve the dominance that it would in the future. Luftwaffe flak units would under such circumstances be more likely to find themselves firing on tanks instead of aircraft. That, however, would very soon change. Soviet air attacks on German ground formations and supply lines never achieved the scale or sophistication realized by the Allies in Western Europe. However, the loss of command of the air in the East did render German forces far more vulnerable, and throughout that period Soviet air assaults began to increase in scale. As German ground defence was increasingly based upon mobile forces, the demand grew for far more flak vehicles able to deal with the problem. In the West, Allied air dominance was overwhelming. D-Day onwards saw a wave of Allied air operations in which fighter bombers roamed across France and the Low Countries, strafing any German ground traffic that could be found. In this typical example, United States Army Air Force P-38 Lightnings and P-47 Thunderbolts fly in low to hit German positions. With the total absence of the Luftwaffe, all the German army could rely upon was flak to protect themselves. But more was always needed, and the demand was that it should be mobile, based upon full-tracked chassis. It was also becoming very clear that many Allied aircraft were now so well protected as to no longer succumb to hits from 20mm flak. Heavier weapons were demanded, with 37mm being the operative calibre to enable Allied aircraft to be brought down in greater numbers. Out of these demands emerged a new generation of German flak panzers. Some were stopgap, placed into service pending production of more sophisticated and powerful types. Examples such as the Kugelblitz and Panther Kolien employed heavier calibre and much faster firing weapons, but none of these reached service before Germany's defeat in May 1945. The Wirbelwind emerged towards the end of 1943 as a fully tracked anti-aircraft tank employing the chassis and body of a Panzer IV. A purpose-built 16mm armoured turret had been designed, within which the crew of the 20mm flak Vierling could operate the gun with a degree of protection. The Wirbelwind are operating on the German border in the vicinity of Metz in late 1944. They're firing on American bombers, and the hail of 20mm cannon shells sent up by the Wirbelwinds has claimed an American B-26 Marauder bomber. Just 86 Wirbelwinds were produced, with production ending in November 1944. By then, the decision had been made that the 20mm calibre was no longer adequate to deal with Allied aircraft, and that continuance of production of a flak panzer with such a weapon was a waste of resources. Replacement for the Wirbelwind was the Ostwind, which employed a single 37mm flak 43 in a similar turret and mounted on a converted Panzer IV. The Flak 43 was also employed in another Panzer IV conversion with a four-sided superstructure that could be dropped for firing. It was named the furniture van for obvious reasons. 240 were produced until March 1945. Both Ostwind and Mobilwagen were to have been replaced by the Kugelblitz, mounting two rapid-fire 30mm cannon in a new turret, but the war ended before it could be produced in any number. Seeing service in the closing months of the war was the drilling anti-aircraft half-track based on the 251D. Armament was three 15mm cannon obtained from obsolete Luftwaffe stocks, which were then attached to a pedestal mount and placed inside the hull of the half-track. All three barrels firing could spew out 2,100 rounds per minute. Those seen here are on the Oder front in March 1945. At the outbreak of war in 1939, the 88mm gun in its various versions, namely the 18, the 36 and the 37, formed the backbone of Germany's air defence system at home and in the Wehrmacht abroad. In its primary role of anti-aircraft gun, the 88mm could fire up to 15 rounds, each weighing 20 pounds, every minute. This is being demonstrated by a Waffen-SS flak crew serving in Russia in the late summer of 1941. Accurate tracking of the Soviet aircraft and the use of rangefinders allow the gunners to place their shells close to the enemy plane. On this occasion, they're also employing a single 20mm flak 30 alongside the 88. The rounds tell as a Soviet bomber, almost certainly a Tupolev SP-2, is hit and plunges downwards, disintegrating during